Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." But what happens when girlhood itself becomes the prison a woman never leaves? Today I ask you, have you ever felt the weight of innocence turned into limitation? This isn't just theory, it's a mirror. Jung's hidden truths reveal that breaking free from girlhood is not only possible, it's the path to claiming your fullest, truest self. Carl Jung often spoke about the archetypes that live within us, shaping the way we think, act, and experience life without us even being fully aware of their influence. Among these archetypes, the girlhood archetype stands out as one of the most misunderstood. When we talk about the girlhood archetype in Jungian psychology, we are not simply referring to the innocence and charm of youth, but to a deeper psychological pattern in which a woman identifies with dependency, fragility, and passivity, and struggles to move beyond it. To Jung, archetypes were not just symbols of culture, but living forces of the psyche, and the girlhood archetype is one such force that can either guide a woman toward growth if integrated, or trap her in perpetual immaturity if left unconscious. Why does this archetype hold such power? At its core, the girlhood archetype is tied to the refusal of individuation. Jung described individuation as the lifelong process of becoming whole, integrating both the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. Yet, for some women, there is resistance to this call. The unconscious chooses comfort over confrontation, dependency over autonomy, and innocence over responsibility. The girlhood archetype offers a kind of safety. By remaining in a childlike state, one avoids the conflicts, challenges, and uncertainties of adulthood. But this safety is illusory. In reality, it creates a prison in which the woman lives a life defined not by her potential, but by her limitations. We must understand that this pattern is not about age, but about identification. A woman may be 30, 40, or 50 years old and still remain bound to the child-woman dynamic. She may seek approval rather than authority, protection rather than partnership, and comfort rather than growth. Jung's psychology reminds us that the archetypes are not inherently good or bad. They are energies that must be balanced. Innocence itself is not the problem. It becomes problematic when it dominates the psyche, eclipsing the other aspects of womanhood that yearn for expression. In many cases, the girlhood archetype becomes most visible in relationships. Here, we see how dependency replaces mutual growth. Instead of engaging as equals, the woman caught in this archetype unconsciously takes the role of the eternal daughter, looking for someone to guide her, protect her, or even save her. Jung noted that when we refuse to meet parts of ourselves, we project them outward. For such a woman, the masculine qualities of strength, authority, and independence are projected onto her partner, while she remains in the passive role. The relationship, then, becomes an enactment of the child-father dynamic rather than a union of equals. But this is not merely about personal choice. It is about unconscious forces at work. The child-woman archetype represents a stage in development where the psyche has not yet moved into full autonomy. Jung observed that when the unconscious dominates, the individual cannot act freely. The woman is not consciously choosing dependency. Rather, she is caught in the grip of an archetypal pattern that feels natural and familiar. And yet, it prevents her from stepping into the deeper call of individuation, where she would claim her authority, strength, and responsibility. The educational value of understanding this archetype is profound. Jung would insist that becoming aware of the girlhood archetype is the first step in breaking its hold. For as long as it remains unconscious, it directs life from the shadows. But when brought to light, it can be seen for what it is, a stage that must be transcended, not a destiny to be lived forever. Jungian psychology invites us to recognize these unconscious identifications, to ask ourselves, am I living from my wholeness, or am I clinging to an archetypal role that no longer serves me? What makes the girlhood archetype so alluring is that it often disguises itself as charm. Innocence, fragility, and dependency are qualities that can win affection, protection, and care from others. On the surface, this seems like a source of power. But Jung reminds us that true power does not come from manipulation or from remaining small. True power comes from integration, from the conscious choice to step into the fullness of the self. Remaining trapped in girlhood is not empowerment, but avoidance. It is also important to see the cultural dimension of this archetype. Jung believed that archetypes manifest not only in individuals, but also in collective consciousness. Our culture often idealizes youth, beauty, and innocence in women, reinforcing the girlhood archetype as an ideal to aspire to. In such a context, the woman who stays in girlhood is not just following her unconscious, but is also being rewarded by societal patterns that glorify the child-woman image. Yet, Jung would caution us that collective ideals are not the same as personal truth. Individuation requires that we confront not only our personal unconscious, but also the collective patterns that would keep us small. So why do some women stay trapped in girlhood? Because the archetype is powerful, because the unconscious resists change, and because culture reinforces the illusion that innocence is safer than maturity. But Jung's hidden truth is that this pattern is not permanent. The girlhood archetype, when recognized, can become a stepping stone rather than a prison. It reminds us of the vulnerability and openness of youth, qualities that have their place, but only as part of a larger whole. The task is not to destroy girlhood but to integrate it, so that it no longer dominates the psyche. Carl Jung's insights here are a call to awareness. He would ask us to see that the woman who remains bound to girlhood is not weak or flawed, but simply unconscious of the deeper journey awaiting her. And he would remind us that the path forward is not about abandoning innocence, but about weaving it together with wisdom, strength, and autonomy. Only then does the feminine psyche move beyond dependency into true individuation, the wholeness that comes when we answer the call to grow. Carl Jung often reminded us that what remains hidden in the unconscious does not simply disappear, it shapes our behavior, our relationships, and even the way we see ourselves. When we consider why some women stay trapped in girlhood, Jung's concept of the shadow becomes essential. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is the part of ourselves we deny, repress, or refuse to acknowledge. It contains not only what we consider dark or shameful, but also the unlived potentials we have not yet embraced. In the case of the girlhood archetype, the shadow manifests as passivity, resistance to responsibility, and the refusal to grow into maturity. This is not a conscious decision. Rather, it is the unconscious holding onto an image of safety, even when that safety keeps the woman bound in limitation. When Jung described the shadow, he emphasized that it is not an enemy to be destroyed but a reality to be integrated. The girlhood archetype, when it dominates, creates a psychological imbalance because the shadow side is left unexamined. A woman might outwardly present herself as innocent, delicate, and dependent, but inwardly she may be avoiding the discomfort that comes with growth and autonomy. Jung would call this being possessed by an archetype, when an archetypal force so strongly occupies the psyche that the person unconsciously lives out its story. In this case, the woman is not truly free. She is repeating the same patterns over and over, bound by what she has not yet faced in herself. To understand this dynamic, think about the archetypal images Jung worked with. Every archetype carries both light and shadow. The girlhood archetype contains beauty, openness, and vulnerability, qualities that can be precious when integrated. But in the shadow, it contains fear, dependency, and a refusal to engage with the deeper realities of life. Jung's insights on female psychology reveal that many women unconsciously identify with this archetype because the culture around them rewards innocence, fragility, and dependency. The shadow grows more powerful when society itself mirrors and validates it. Instead of confronting their hidden fears of adulthood, responsibility, and self-sovereignty, women may unconsciously cling to the safety of remaining small, because both the unconscious and the external world support this identification. Shadow work and the girlhood archetype then become crucial for breaking free. Jung would argue that the task is not to reject or deny girlhood, but to bring its shadow aspects into awareness. For instance, a woman might ask herself, why do I feel safer being dependent than being autonomous? Why do I fear stepping into my authority? Why do I unconsciously prefer to let others make choices for me? These questions lead to the heart of shadow work. The goal is not to outgrow girlhood by force, but to integrate its lessons and limitations into a larger sense of self. The resistance to responsibility is one of the most common shadow aspects here. Jung understood that the ego often avoids responsibility because responsibility requires the confrontation of the unconscious. To take responsibility for one's life means acknowledging that no one is coming to save you, that the authority you seek in others must be cultivated within. For the woman trapped in girlhood, this is a frightening realization, because dependency feels easier than sovereignty. Yet Jung believed that the shadow, when faced, becomes a source of strength. The very energy once used to avoid responsibility can, when integrated, fuel personal growth and deeper self-realization. It is also important to see how this shadow manifests in relationships. Women who unconsciously remain in girlhood often find themselves repeating relational patterns where they adopt the role of the dependent daughter. They unconsciously attract partners who embody authority or dominance, not necessarily out of compatibility, but because the shadow seeks to balance itself through the other. Jung explained that what is unintegrated in ourselves often shows up in projection onto others. In this way, the woman projects her dissound strength and authority onto her partner, while she remains in the shadow role of fragility. The relationship becomes a stage for the archetype, rather than a conscious union between equals. However, Jung did not see this as hopeless. He believed that by bringing the shadow into consciousness, we transform the very patterns that once bound us. A woman recognizing her own resistance to maturity can begin to see how it limits her. She can take back the projections she has placed onto others, realizing that the authority she once gave away to a partner or parent figure must now be cultivated within herself. Jung's hidden truth here is that the shadow, when embraced, becomes a source of wholeness. By acknowledging the fear of responsibility, a woman can begin to step into her own authority. By seeing her dependency clearly, she can choose interdependence rather than unconscious submission. The educational lesson in all of this is profound. The shadow is not simply a negative force. It is a teacher waiting to be recognized. For the woman caught in the girlhood archetype, her shadow is the very place where growth is possible. By confronting the unconscious fears of adulthood, responsibility, and individuation, she begins the process of freeing herself from archetypal possession. Jung insisted that individuation requires us to walk into the shadow, because only by facing what we fear most can we integrate the parts of ourselves that lead us to wholeness. Thus, the girlhood archetype becomes a trap only when the shadow remains unconscious. Once the shadow is brought into awareness, girlhood can be transformed from limitation into a stage of the journey. Innocence and vulnerability no longer need to mask dependency and fear. Instead, they can be integrated with strength, autonomy, and wisdom. In Jung's view, the confrontation with the shadow is not easy, but it is the path to liberation. For women who remain trapped in girlhood, the invitation is clear: face the shadow, claim your responsibility, and step into the fullness of who you are meant to become. Carl Jung once said that we do not really fall in love with another person. We fall in love with the image of them that lives within our own unconscious. This insight becomes especially powerful when we examine why some women, trapped in the girlhood archetype, repeat relational patterns that resemble the father-daughter dynamic rather than entering into mature partnerships. Emotional immaturity in relationships, as psychology shows us, is rarely random. It is a reflection of archetypal patterns, projections, and complexes that continue to shape the way intimacy unfolds. When a woman unconsciously identifies with the child-woman archetype, she often finds herself reenacting old stories of dependency and protection, seeking in her partner the authority and strength that she has not yet integrated within herself. In Jung's framework, this process can be understood through projection and the dynamics of the anima and animus. Jung explained that every psyche contains both masculine and feminine energies, regardless of gender. For women, the animus represents the inner masculine principle, the energy of authority, reason, and independence. Yet when a woman has not yet developed or integrated her animus, she often projects it outward onto men in her life. Instead of recognizing her own potential for authority and self-reliance, she unconsciously places these qualities onto a partner. This projection fuels the relational dynamic, where the man becomes the savior or protector, while she remains in the dependent role of the girl. It feels natural, even comforting, but it is not truly a conscious partnership. This pattern explains why emotional immaturity in relationships is so persistent. If a woman continues to unconsciously play the role of the child, she will unconsciously seek out men who are either willing to play the father figure or who reinforce the imbalance by dominating or controlling the relationship. Jung would describe this as the psyche being possessed by an archetypal role. In this possession, the woman does not relate as her whole self, but as an aspect of herself, bound to a symbolic pattern. The relationship is then less about two individuals meeting as equals and more about an archetype acting itself out through human lives. The consequences of this dynamic are often subtle but profound. On the surface, the woman may appear to have what she longs for: care, protection, or even adoration. Yet beneath it lies an erosion of equality and mutual growth. The woman who identifies with the child, woman archetype avoids the difficult work of individuation by relying on her partner's authority. At the same time, the partner may unconsciously welcome the role of protector, but often at the cost of authentic intimacy. Jung would remind us that projection always distorts reality. The man is not truly seen for who he is, but for the role he is asked to play. And the woman is not fully seen either, because she hides her true potential behind the mask of dependence. Jung's insights on female psychology are invaluable here. He observed that when a woman refuses to develop her inner masculine, her animus, she is left dependent on outer masculine figures to carry that function for her. This not only weakens her sense of self, but also creates imbalance in her relationships. The father-daughter dynamic becomes a repeating pattern, a psychological loop where maturity is deferred and wholeness is postponed. Such a woman may find herself perpetually dissatisfied, longing for deeper intimacy but unable to cultivate it, because the relationship remains one-sided. One might ask, why does this dynamic persist if it is so limiting? The answer lies in familiarity and unconscious comfort. Jung taught that the psyche tends to repeat what is familiar, even if it is painful, because it feels known. For the woman trapped in girlhood, seeking a partner who resembles a protective father figure feels safer than risking the vulnerability of equality. To step into maturity would mean confronting her own shadow, the fear of responsibility, the discomfort of independence, and the uncertainty of self-reliance. Remaining in the child role avoids this confrontation, but it also prevents true fulfillment. The educational lesson here is that projection must eventually be withdrawn for genuine intimacy to occur. Jung said that the work of individuation involves reclaiming what we project onto others and integrating it into our own psyche. For the woman caught in the child-woman archetype, this means recognizing that the strength, authority, and protection she seeks in a partner are qualities she must develop within herself. Only then can she meet a partner as an equal, not as a child seeking a parent. The relationship, freed from projection, becomes a space of mutual recognition rather than archetypal reenactment. There is also a cultural layer to consider. Jung noted that archetypes are not only personal but collective, shaping entire societies. In many cultures, women are encouraged, even rewarded, for remaining in roles of dependency or fragility. The image of the maternal daughter is idealized, while autonomy and authority in women are often met with resistance or criticism. This collective reinforcement makes it even harder for a woman to break free of the child-woman archetype. She is not only confronting her unconscious, but also swimming against the current of societal expectations. Jung's hidden truth here is that individuation often requires standing apart from the collective, daring to claim the self even when the culture resists it. Healing from these relational patterns is neither quick nor easy, but it begins with awareness. When a woman begins to see how she unconsciously repeats the father-daughter dynamic, she can start to question her choices, her attractions, and her expectations in love. She can begin to notice when she is projecting authority onto her partner, and instead ask how she might claim that authority for herself. Jung emphasized that the path of individuation is a lifelong journey, and for women caught in this archetype, it is a journey toward integrating their animus, reclaiming their independence, and embracing the fullness of their own psyche. Ultimately, Jung would remind us that love cannot truly flourish when it is bound by archetypal possession. Genuine intimacy requires both individuals to stand in their wholeness, free from projection, free from unconscious reenactments. For women who remain trapped in girlhood, this means stepping out of the dependent role and into the fullness of maturity, where love is not about being saved, but about meeting another soul as an equal. In this way, the relational dynamic shifts from reenacting old wounds to creating something truly conscious, a partnership rooted not in archetypal repetition, but in authentic connection. Carl Jung often emphasized that the true task of human life is individuation, the journey of becoming whole by integrating both our conscious choices and our unconscious patterns. When we speak about women who remain trapped in the girlhood archetype, Jung's hidden truth is not that they are condemned to remain there, but that the path to healing lies in awareness and integration. Healing from the child, woman archetype requires more than simply growing older or trying to behave differently. It requires deep inner work, the kind of psychological transformation that Jung devoted his life to describing at its core. The girlhood archetype is not something to be destroyed, but something to be understood. Jung reminded us that every archetype has both light and shadow, and the task of the psyche is to unite these opposites rather than suppress one in favor of the other. The qualities of girlhood, innocence, openness, and vulnerability, are not inherently negative. In fact, they can be powerful when consciously integrated into adult life. The problem arises when these qualities dominate the psyche unconsciously, creating dependency, avoidance of responsibility, and resistance to maturity. Healing, then, means neither rejecting girlhood entirely nor being possessed by it, but transforming it into a balanced and conscious part of the self. The process of healing begins with awareness. Jung believed that we cannot change what we do not recognize. For a woman caught in the child-woman archetype, the first step is to see how the archetype shapes her life, in her relationships, her self-image, and her choices. This requires a willingness to confront the unconscious. Shadow work is central here, because the shadow of the girlhood archetype often contains the fears and resistances that keep her small: the fear of independence, the fear of failure, the fear of no longer being cared for. By shining a light on these fears, a woman begins to understand that they are not destiny, but patterns that can be transformed. Jung would say that the unconscious often speaks through relationships. Many women recognize their entrapment in girlhood not by looking inward first, but by noticing the repetition of external patterns. For example, repeatedly choosing partners who dominate control or take on the role of protector reveals the projection of the inner masculine, the animus, onto others. Healing involves withdrawing these projections and realizing that the authority, strength, and independence sought in others must also be cultivated within. This is not an easy task, but Jung insisted that the energy we give away through projection is the very energy we need to complete ourselves. By reclaiming these projections, a woman begins to see that she is not dependent on another to provide what she has always carried within her own psyche. Cultural forces also make this healing more complex. Jung acknowledged that individuation often requires breaking away from the collective, and for women, this means resisting societal ideals that glorify youth, fragility, and passivity. Our culture often rewards the performance of girlhood, even in adulthood, while punishing women who embody strength and authority. This collective pressure reinforces the archetype, making it feel safer to remain in girlhood than to embrace maturity. Healing, then, is not only personal but also collective. A woman must choose to claim her independence, even when society encourages her to remain dependent. Jung described this as the heroic act of individuation, standing apart from the crowd to follow the deeper call of the soul. The journey out of girlhood also requires integrating new experiences. For many women, stability, self-trust, and emotional autonomy feel foreign because they were never fully nurtured in childhood. This is why maturity can feel uncomfortable at first. Jung taught that the psyche resists what is unfamiliar, clinging instead to what it knows. But transformation requires enduring this discomfort, allowing new patterns to take root. By practicing autonomy, making independent choices, setting boundaries, and cultivating self-reliance, the woman learns to expand beyond the limits of the archetype. Over time, what once felt threatening becomes natural, and what once felt safe is revealed to have been a prison. A key element in Jung's teaching is that wholeness does not come from rejecting parts of ourselves, but from integration. Healing from the child-woman archetype is not about erasing the qualities of girlhood, but about placing them in balance with maturity, wisdom, and strength. Innocence can coexist with responsibility. Vulnerability can coexist with autonomy. Openness can coexist with discernment. When these polarities are held together, the woman no longer lives as a fragmented self caught between extremes, but as an integrated whole. This is the essence of individuation, the ability to hold and harmonize the opposites within us. Jung also pointed out that healing is a spiral, not a straight line. The archetype may resurface at different stages of life, especially during times of stress or transition. But each time it arises, it presents another opportunity for integration. Instead of being pulled back into unconscious identification, the woman can use these moments as reminders of how far she has come and how much more of herself she is ready to claim. This ongoing process is what Jung described as the lifelong task of becoming who we truly are. In educational terms, the girlhood archetype serves as a profound lesson in the workings of the unconscious. It shows us how powerful archetypes are in shaping identity, how the shadow can bind us when unacknowledged, and how projection distorts relationships. But it also shows us the path to transformation. For Jung, the privilege of a lifetime was to become the person you were meant to be. For women trapped in girlhood, that privilege comes when they embrace the challenge of individuation, integrate their shadow, reclaim their projections, and step into the fullness of their feminine wholeness. Thus, healing from the child, woman archetype is not simply about maturity in the social sense, but about psychological and spiritual integration. It is about answering Jung's call to make the unconscious conscious, to stop living as the eternal daughter and begin living as the whole woman, one who carries within her the innocence of girlhood, the strength of maturity, and the wisdom of her integrated self. Carl Jung revealed to us that the unconscious is never silent. It shapes our choices, our desires, and even the roles we unconsciously play. The journey through the girlhood archetype is not about blaming or shaming, but about recognizing how powerful archetypal forces can be when left unexamined. Some women remain bound to innocence and dependency because it feels safe, others because society rewards it. But Jung's hidden truths remind us that safety without growth is only another form of captivity. The lesson of all these speeches is clear. Girlhood is not meant to be a lifelong state but a stage, one that must be integrated into the broader arc of individuation. When women confront the shadow of passivity, withdraw the projections that place authority in others, and begin to embody their own autonomy, they transform girlhood into a source of balance rather than bondage. Jung teaches us that individuation is not the rejection of who we have been, but the integration of every stage of our becoming. So the question remains, will we allow ourselves to remain possessed by the child, woman archetype, or will we step into the fuller truth of who we are? The invitation is to claim not just the innocence of girlhood, but the strength, responsibility, and wisdom that complete the feminine psyche. For Jung, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and that path always leads beyond the prison of archetypes into the freedom of wholeness.